Hello, and thanks everyone for coming to another of the Department of Education Reform's lectures. We are a schizophrenic department today because we also have a conference going on pensions over at the town center that Rick talked to this morning. So that's where some of our department is, and some other people are as well. So we have with us today Rick Hess. Rick got his PhD from the government department at Harvard, along with Pat and me. We were all contemporaries briefly. Rick was 4 years behind us, so that's why he's so much younger and better looking. So Rick's dissertation turned into the book Spinning Wheels, which was about how school districts are constantly reforming. That people are pushing them to reform, but as it turns out, they already are reforming. They're trying to reform all the time. The problem is not that they're not trying to reform. The problem is that they never really follow through on any of the reforms they have. They just keep trying whatever the latest reform is that's being suggested to them, so they're just spinning their wheels. And since that time, I believe Rick has written 400 books, something close to that number.
Tell them about the bat.
Well, right. So I was going to mention the bat. So Rick, unbeknownst to him, has earned me a steak dinner. We had a conference at Georgetown in 2006 where Marcus Winters and I had a bet. I bet that Rick would publish 5 books within 2 years. And if he did that or more, I got a steak dinner from Marcus. And the deal is that it has to be a steak dinner for the winner plus Rick. Okay? So Rick wins either way. He gets a steak dinner. I've yet to collect, nor has Rick. But I was confident enough in Rick's productivity that I can earn a steak dinner out of the deal. So now, the most recent of the 400 books is the same thing over and over, which feels a little bit like spinning wheels, right? So it's the same thing. It's spinning wheels over and over, I think, or something. But we're going to find out more about Rick's latest oeuvre, and we're very eager to have him here, and very appreciative that he made the trip. Thanks a lot, Rick.
Hey, thanks, Jay. Yeah, no, it's terrific to be here with all of you. It's funny, Pat and Jay and I go way back, and I was always like the little cute graduate student behind. So it's always nice to see you guys. So Jay's actually exactly right. This is a book where I try to think about some of the institutional challenges of school improvement, really using history, not using history as thinking in terms of an educational historian, but thinking about history as a way for us to understand how we got where we are and what that implies for how we think our way forward. So I come to this stuff. I once upon a time, I taught high school over in East Baton Rouge Parish. I got frustrated. I went to Harvard to do my PhD thinking about these questions as a political scientist. And then I wound up in the School of Education at the University of Virginia for 5 years, where I got recruited to AEI. One of the pieces I wrote, one of the pieces that got me a lot of attention early in my career, was in 2001. I wrote a piece called "Tear Down This Wall." My own experience at getting my my teaching credential and master's at Harvard Ed School, once upon a time, and my teaching was that I was unpersuaded that teacher licensure was a terrific way to control quality, or to ensure that teachers were well suited to their jobs. And I wrote this piece for Andy Rotherham, as some of you may know, when he was at the Progressive Policy Institute, and we launched it at the National Press Club. One discussant was Wendy Kopp, the founder of Teach for America. The other discussant was David Emmett, then the president of the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education. And it was funny primarily because David called on my dean while we were at the National Press Club to fire me, which is not exactly what you want as like a third-year assistant prof. But, he did it. It worked out okay. But one of the things that struck me, in the next year, USA Today endorsed this as its preferred model, and Secretary Page was waving this around during when we were talking about highly qualified teacher provision of NCLB. And I wound up in a lot of these conversations, and something struck me. That what I was arguing in this piece was that teacher licensure probably isn't a great way to ensure teacher quality, because the things that we care about in teaching are things like mentoring, empathy, connection. These are all valuable and important things. We're just not very good at systematically knowing if teachers are good at it, or systematically knowing how to teach them. The things that we are good at ensuring teachers know, through the practice exams, what have you, are things like content knowledge. Now the problem is the people who are most in support of teacher licensure want a license on the soft stuff, and they're generally less interested in licensing on the content stuff. If we think about the analogs, engineering, medicine, law, we don't actually license based on the soft stuff. What we license on is a minimal body of knowledge. In things that are all about soft stuff, like journalism and business management, we recognize the value of good graduate preparation. We just don't mandate it. Anyway, I was making these arguments, and I was just getting, it was just ugly. The National Board of Professional Teaching Standard types, and these folks would hold these forums, and people would just, it was strange, because they were hearing what I was saying not as an opportunity to think differently about how do we actually control entry teaching. They heard what I was saying as a personal attack on their worthiness, on their decency, on their life's work. Along the way, I got in the habit of starting to talk about the issue. I'd say, wait a minute. Now look, teacher licensure is not a dumb thing in and of itself. A century and a half ago, when we were trying to come up with some norms to ensure that people being put in schools had some basic skills, had been trained in some minimal fashion, and when communication meant the Pony Express, and when data meant, you filed to the state how many pencils you could count, perhaps it was not an unreasonable way to control quality. It's simply the case that it's probably not a great fit for where we are today. What was interesting about talking this way was not that there was any magic in it, but that it seemed to have the effect of helping us get the conversation off of a question of who hated kids more, and into a conversation of, had things really changed that much? What was the problem? Was this a sensible solution? That's what this book flows from. This book really starts from the premise that many of the debates we have today, whether it's over merit pay, whether it's over teacher evaluation, whether it's over accountability, are really, we wind up dug into these trenches where one side of the debate wants to defend schools against the attack of corporate cronies. The other side wants to save children from the depredations of teacher unions. And you have to pick a side. And I find on issue after issue, I don't want to pick either of these sides. And this book is me trying to figure out, how do we think differently? Are there, not is there a middle ground? I hate the middle ground. But are there other ways to think about this and solve this in the ways we've been stuck in? So, if you're familiar with the myth of Sisyphus. Myth of Sisyphus, right? Greek mythology, Sisyphus condemned to Hades, and he's eternally trying to roll a boulder up the hill. Every time he gets halfway up, slides back down. For me, if you think about, say, at least the last 40 or 50 years of American education reform, I think that's, a beautiful analogy. You think of any number of incrementally promising innovations, which people get very excited about, and then we try to do them in a lot of places, and they don't work at scale, and we say, damn it, we're almost there. We've got to tweak them. And so what we do is we spend lots of time talking about things like differentiated instruction, and how do you do a turnaround model, and how do you modify professional development. And to me, that's a lot like standing by this poor son of a bitch and saying, maybe you need better shoes. Maybe you got to spread your hands a little wider. What we're overlooking is this simple kind of insight that the guy's pushing a beach ball up a friggin' mountain. Maybe the mountain, it ought to be item one. And for me, that mountain is the way that we have arranged the institutions of American schooling. It's the assumptions of geographically based districts. It's the assumption that schools are catch-all entities for meeting every need of every kid in a geographic catchment area. It's the notion that we have to take the teaching job as we've inherited it. And by forcing people to work within those structures, we make it enormously difficult for them to actually go ahead and roll that ball. Right? So, Einstein may or may not have said this, but I think it's largely true. We get very excited. We keep, one of my great delights last year waiting for Superman was the notion that, finally we're going to wake up people, and it was going to create such a political tsunami that we would finally change American education. And today we've got people saying big, bold things about schooling. Gates called high schools obsolete. Obama has said that nothing more is at stake in the American dream. We're finally at a moment where after decades of not paying attention, Americans care passionately about school improvement. Except the problem is that this stuff goes on and on. And you can go back into the 1870s and find this stuff in the New York Times if you're so inclined. It's not like any of this is new. There's been concerns about the quality of schooling forever. Now, in fact, right, nobody here, everybody here has seen this chart more times than they need to, right? If you look, say, at NAEP performance in the last 40 years, and you look at expenditures, this is what you would call a company you would dump from your portfolio. It's not a happy picture. Now, the problem is we keep talking about what would be the pedagogical, the instructional, the curricular innovation that we can finally weave into these systems that will make things work. Let's take the small high schools, just the way of thinking about it. Bill Gates, has pointed out that high schools are obsolete. So we were very excited 10 years ago about the notion that we were going to come up with high schools which were actually going to be more rigorous, more personal, more coherent, relationships, good stuff. So we take this, and how do you fundamentally transform the nature of a century-and-a-half-old institution? You shrink it. We're going to leave the same high schools, we're going to fund them the same ways, we're going to use the same curricular guides, we're going to use the same faculty, but we're going to take a 1,200-person school and we're going to break it into 400-person schools. And that is supposed to accomplish something. Now, for those of you who remember this, the funny thing is, 45 years ago, former Harvard President James Conant wrote a hugely influential book arguing that the problem with the quality of American high school education was it needed to be larger. Because you needed larger schools in order to have critical mass so you could actually staff the subjects. So one of the problems is, because we're constantly trying to figure out how do we take this existing CAD chassis and how do we tweak it to work, so we constantly find up in these strange, peculiar spinning wheel back and forth, where we're going from one to another miracle cure. So today we're excited about technology. Right? So we're not actually going to rethink schools, we're not going to rethink districts, we're going to simply offer virtual learning aside everything else we're already doing. And somehow, the introduction of technology itself is going to make a big difference. Got to tell you, that's not how most of the world actually works. I kind of like this one. One of the problems with... Okay, thanks a moment.
Slow burn.
Right? And we have this, right? We have this fascination with the notion that what we got to figure out is what works and then have schools do it. We got to do more of it. Problem is, it's not always just knowing what to do. So General Motors, for instance, 1958, the most successful company in the world. Right? Today, right? Last year we all had to buy a big chunk of it because that company had run itself into the tank. Was it that the people running General Motors had once been really smart and then got really stupid and no longer knew what to do? Was it they'd never heard of Toyota in the intervening half century? No. They actually spent a whole boatload of money over the years on consultants telling them what they needed to do. And what did they hear they needed to do? Well, they heard that they had too many different automotive lines. They had too many different chassis, which required that you spread your investment over lots of different engineering teams. You have to stockpile lots of parts. It was really expensive. Why did they do this? Because back when they were the biggest, best company in the world, they had a model where people would buy a car, they would sell it in 2, 3, 4 years, and they would buy the next model up. So what GM tried to do is have a hierarchy of 8 or 10 models that ideally were going to walk somebody who was a car buyer through their entire life. Made a ton of sense. It was a great business model. So it was a great business model when cars had a certain lifespan, when people bought in a certain way. 1958, GM signed with UAW the Treaty of Detroit, often regarded as the best example of management-labor collaboration of the era. This was the stuff that offered enormous benefits. If you were riffed by GM as a UAW employee, you got 95% of your compensation indefinitely. Now, how could GM make this model work? Because they never had to riff people. The whole point was to get all of the best, hardworking 18-year-olds in Flint and Detroit and Pontiac to want to work for GM. So they offered them great benefits, huge health care, which was okay because their workforce was still pretty young, not a lot of retirees. People didn't live that long. So it was a great contract for that era. GM has 5,600 dealers in its network nationally. One of the things we heard about all through the congressional conversations about the GM bailout was how enormously costly these are. Well, once upon a time, before Edmunds.com, before you bought cars over the internet, this was huge. A, this was how people went and bought cars. You wanted somebody who was proximate. And B, if you have 5,600 car dealers, you've got car dealers in tons of legislative districts. This becomes hugely useful when you're talking about political relationships. Well, each of these things were really good in 1958, in 1968, and they became less good in 1988. But the problem is they're really hard to unwind. Once you've negotiated that union contract, it is really, really hard to get the UAW to start giving stuff back. In fact, they just don't. Once you've got that extended dealer network, all those dealers now have a property right, and when you need to start consolidating, because they're soaking up your resources, they're no longer using their relationships politically for you, they're using them to resist you. All of these different automotive lines that you have to consolidate, turns out it's really hard to get rid of them because each of those lines has got people in the company whose entire career is built on that. So you start consolidating, it's about zeroing out jobs. So it's not that GM got stupid. It's that the stuff that worked for GM at one era stopped working. But when it stops working, you can't just get rid of it. It sticks around. Now, how do we deal with this problem usually in the private sector? We don't. Right? We simply don't. Of America's 25 biggest companies today, 3/4 did not exist in 1965. The average Fortune 500 company today was born about 1961. How did we deal with new opportunities in the airline industry? With the fact that in 1976, only one American in four had ever been on an airplane. When the FAA deregulated, TWA, Pan Am, the giants of an era that had all the best pilots, all the best stewardesses, all the premier gates, the best planes, turned out they were poorly situated for the new world. Because what people wanted when you started letting us regular folk get on planes, not on business accounts, we didn't necessarily want all the amenities, because we weren't willing to pay for them. The people who actually came in and did well was a little outfit called Southwest that started in Texas in 1969, which only flew in Texas because that way it wasn't regulated by the FAA. So they were able to do different turnaround times. They were able to use different staffing structures. So how did TWA and Pan Am fix it? How did they import the best practices? They didn't. They went away. Microsoft in the early 1990s spent billions trying to figure out how did you leverage this new thing called the internet. They had all the talent, all the money. But what they were trying to do is they were trying to figure out how did they take what they already knew how to do, this huge enterprise system they'd invested in, the Windows platform, and how do you get people to want to use it online? Turned out that was a huge disadvantage. The people who actually figured this out were people who had a lot fewer resources, but also weren't already wedded to existing ways of thinking and doing. So the way that we usually solve this problem is that as technology changes, as the talent pool changes, as organizational knowledge changes, as consumer demand changes, old organizations die because they're unable to figure out how to meet new challenges. And new organizations emerge which are better situated to a changing era. In schooling, we don't get to do that. Every single school district in the United States today, every single one already existed in 1961, or is a consolidation of 2 or more districts that did. That means every piece of contract language, every statute, every regulation, every decision in place in 1961 is still with us, unless we go in and forcefully and actually uproot it by hand. Now, one response is, well, but not that much has really changed about education, so who cares? Well, let me suggest at least 6 big things have changed since we built out the American school system. First, the importance we accord to schooling. It just didn't matter that much once upon a time. You know, in 1905, 40% of Americans worked in agriculture. 2, what we want graduates to know. 200 years ago, literacy was defined as the ability to write your name. 65% of Americans were literate at the time of the Revolution. By that definition, today our expectations are slightly higher. 3, we like to think at least, right? 3, the values we want schools to promote. Once upon a time, the whole point of common schooling was to take these Irish Catholic heathen and teach them to behave more like the WASPs who are already in the country. It was, that's your goal, if you're trying to take kids and make them not be like their heathen parents, but be more like us, then it makes a lot of sense to mandate what books they have to read. You make them read the King James Bible. It makes a lot of sense to insist who's allowed to teach them. It makes a lot of sense for the state to run the schools, because the whole purpose, the explicit purpose of schooling, is to make these kids be the way we want them to be. Today, we're very uncomfortable with that set of aims. Today, the watchwords in education are diversity, tolerance. If that's the case, the values that we want schools to promote are different, and potentially the machinery that we want schools to use to promote it would be very different. 4th, the prospects for graduates. 1900, 1 American in 10 finished high school. It didn't actually have much of a negative impact on their life chances. Today, if you haven't finished high school, your future is bleak. If you don't go into college, the likelihood you're paying a huge price in terms of earnings. 5th, the pool of available teachers. In the 1950s, 55% of college-educated women became teachers. Today it's 15%. We didn't lose the 40% we wanted to, we lost the 40% we didn't want to. As the pool of talent available for teaching has changed, you might think that we need to rethink how we craft the job and how we recruit talent. Finally, the tools at our disposal. We've always had distance education. There was distance education in the 19th century. What you would do is you would sign up with one of these correspondence schools, which would send your little booklet to you via the Pony Express. And 6 months later, you would send it back. That was, A, limited in terms of timelines, but B, it was a pretty awkward way to try to bring expertise from one community to another. Today, we have the ability to have somebody who can tutor in Fargo and have them tutor a kid in Fayetteville in French, in algebra, and reading routinely. We have new tools at our disposal that once didn't exist. It only makes sense to question how you think about those as our elements of design. Well, the common school is what my friend Diane Ravitch likes to accuse much of the reform conversation of attacking. Let's keep in mind, the common school was built for a particular reason. Common school was built in the middle of the 19th century during a massive wave of immigration, the first huge initial push from Ireland, when folks in Massachusetts were concerned about the behavior of these folks. The common school was a mechanism for teaching these unwashed to behave more like Americans. This wasn't a new concept. Benjamin Rush and Thomas Jefferson were the 2 founders who most frequently wrote about education. And Benjamin Rush very explicitly saw the purpose of common schools as to turn Americans into Republican machines. He said this is what public schooling is for. To the extent that one is wedded to that vision, then the traditional common school apparatus makes sense. To the extent that you're not wedded to that vision, to the extent that your goals and expectations have changed, it's not an attack on schooling to say you should change the machinery. It's just embracing the obvious. Remember, American schooling has been with us. The first compulsory ed law in the U.S. was passed in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1647. It was from 1647 until 1970, until 90% of Americans were showing up in school every day. So it took us more than 3 centuries. It took us 14 generations just to get 90% of Americans to show up in a schoolhouse every day. Got to tell you, probably not shocking that if we spent 3.5 centuries just trying to build boxes where we could get kids off the streets, out of the labor force, and into a place where we could teach them some minimal social graces, that those schools are not particularly well engineered for high-powered 21st century learning. None of us should be shocked about that. None of us should be defensive about the need that we need to rethink the schools. And in fact, the nature of the common school era is that you're trying to build a system of schools that can serve all kids. And if you're trying to do that, what you try to do is systematize. This was an era before data systems. This was an era before measurements. So how do you systemize? You systemize by measuring and controlling inputs. Why do kids sit in age-graded classrooms? Because when Horace Mann, who was president of the Massachusetts Board of Ed, 1837-49, went over to Europe, he was infatuated with the German and French model of having kids sit in age-graded rooms. It seemed very efficient. Why did the French and Germans think this was cool? Because the French and Germans were impressed during the Napoleonic Wars by how ordered the platoons were in the French army. And they thought, we ought to take that same set of insights and apply them to schooling, because kids look so much more orderly. So today, we are still find ourselves kind of, just as a default, embracing a notion of classroom organization premised on Horace Mann's favorable impression of how the Germans and French interpreted the lessons of Napoleonic doctrine. I think it's okay for us to say that perhaps there are smarter, more thoughtful ways to organize kids for purposes of instruction. School calendar. It's not actually an agrarian calendar. The reason that we have the 180-day summer off calendar is because most of American education got patterned out of New England, because that's where we did the stuff first. And in New England, it was profoundly unsafe in the 19th century for kids and teachers to be clustered inside buildings. There was no air conditioning. It was unsanitary. You had to worry about diseases. So the key was to try to get kids out to the countryside. And failing that, because remember, you had sewage in the gutters. And we're talking at a time before modern sewage. The key was to get people out of the building. Well, today, for huge numbers of our at-risk kids, they're a hell of a lot safer in school than they are out of school in the summertime. Rather than thinking about summer learning as some kind of mandatory or one-size-fits-all, how do you think about creating options that actually address the needs of these kids? Carnegie Unit. Carnegie Unit actually came about because when Andrew Carnegie was trying to get high schools to conform to, was trying to make sure that high schools were pairing kids in a way that colleges could systematically count their credits. He used as a carrot the opportunity for high school teachers to enroll in the new TIA-CREF pension system that Carnegie was underwriting. But in order for a school's faculty to be eligible for TIA-CREF, the school had to adopt Carnegie units. Because at that point in time, when you had no other way of knowing what a kid had learned, making sure a child had sat in a room for 100x days for 45 minutes was better than the alternatives as far as making sure they had learned something. Yet what's peculiar today, when we actually have lots of other ways to measure what kids have learned, that we still get caught up on questions of whether or not we're going to ensure kids have reached the requisite number of Carnegie units. That's the school box. Second box, when you're building out the common schools, the problem is you needed to fill those schools with teachers. And the problem is teachers weren't available. In the early 19th century, teaching was not a feminine profession. It was a male-dominated profession. In 1810, 90% of America's teachers were men. This was actually the historical norm going back to Greece. It was a profession for men to do itinerantly on their way to more important and significant work. In order to fill up the common schools, we actually feminized the profession. It had been considered inappropriate for women to interact with other people's children outside of their home, going into the early 1800s. It was okay for them to teach other people's children in their home. This was the famous dame schools, which look a lot like today's kind of home-based, daycare centers. But it was considered inappropriate for women to interact with people's kids outside their home. So what we did was we redefined the appropriate bounds of womanhood, and part of that was we needed to create institutions that would train these women and how they should behave around other people's kids, to teach them the norms. So we launched the first normal schools. First normal school, in fact, launched 2 years after Horace Mann had begun the push for common schools in Massachusetts, 1839, the Lexington Academy. That's where teacher colleges came from. They were institutions to teach women how do you behave around other people's kids outside the home. Now, the nice thing about this labor was women weren't going to be able to do anything else. So you could pay them half of what you paid men. You didn't have to worry about competing for talent. So by the time you start to build out the school system in the progressive era, you've built in these massive inequities. You've got K-8 teachers earn about half what 9 and 12 teachers earn, because high school teachers were disproportionately likely to be men. And so there was a huge push by teachers for something that was less manifestly unfair. What they pushed for was something called the step and lane pay scale, in which we would pay teachers based on the credentials they held and how long they had taught, rather than on their gender or race. Nothing wrong with the step and lane pay scale. To my mind, it was a perfectly reasonable accommodation at that historical point. Today, are you for or against teachers, depending on how you feel about step and lane pay? Well, I'm not for or against it. I would have been for it in 1915. I think it's a dumb way to manage talent in 2011. That doesn't strike me as inconsistent. There was another thing going on. Teachers got fired for all kinds of reasons. There were a dozen states in 1930 that would fire teachers as soon as they got pregnant. New York State was firing people in the 30s because they didn't conform, their weight didn't conform to a specified height and weight charts. 11 states fired teachers during the Pomerades era because they were suspected of being communists. This led to a push for something called tenure, like we had in higher education. Got to tell you, when you're being fired because you're pudgy, and I'm pudgy, I'm sympathetic to fighting for tenure. It's not that tenure was a bad idea. I think it was reasonable. However, this was an era before teachers were subject to civil service protections. This was an era before there was anything else in place to protect them. So the argument, to my mind, is not that tenure is itself innately good or bad. It's that tenure was a response to a particular set of circumstances. Today, those circumstances have changed. Perfectly appropriate to rethink them. The other thing that goes on with teachers is we came up with the mindset that the way that you do teaching well is you put X number of kids in a box with a teacher who does everything for them. Now, if that's the case, what you want to do is try to get fewer and fewer kids in that box. Because the logic is all teachers, one are as good as another, so the fewer kids a teacher handles, the better their teaching must be. So between 1955 and today, we have tripled the number of teachers in this country. We've gone from 1.1 to 3.4 million teachers. We now have a teacher, we are now in a situation where more than 10% of all working adults with a college degree are teachers. So you go to any campus, not good campuses, you go to the worst possible college campus you could think of, and you count every 10th person, and the odds are more or less are going to be teachers. And actually that campus is substantially higher than 1 in 10. This is the situation we have to deal with. Third thing that we built out as the common school era is geographic monopolies. In 1910, if you lived in Fayetteville, and you wanted to get a tractor or you wanted to get a toothbrush, the trick was to get somebody to actually import that in from wherever the hell it was produced. So if you had a Sears and Roebuck in Chicago or St. Louis, that's where you would go. And you would go and you would take the toothbrush they sold. And you would order your tractor, and you were happy as a clam. Because the trick was getting that stuff to Chicago or St. Louis. Today, that's not how we buy things. Today, you walk over to Walgreens, and they've got 43 kinds of toothbrushes. You pick the one that suits. And and when you're bored, you get on your iPhone, you go to Amazon, and you order your John Deere while we're sitting here. And it'll show up at your house. Right? The difference is that new tools, technology, communication, transportation, have made it possible for us to focus not on coordination and delivery of services, but on quality and customization of services. School districts reject that logic. In 1910, we had about 85,000 school districts in the U.S. Every school more or less had its own district. Over the course of the 20th century, those expanded. We now have about 14,000 school districts. The logic of the school district is that it is going to meet the needs of all the kids in a catchment area. That makes it hard to do anything especially well. If you are a school district and you offer choices by having lots of different schools, it means you are expecting within your own operation to have people who are good at doing lots of different kinds of schools well. That is challenging. Another way we often do this in the world is we don't actually ask each organization to do everything. If you don't like an iPad, we don't try to figure out how to make an iPad that's going to accommodate each and every user. We allow other providers to come in with alternative configurations that might make more sense for particular clients. All right, 3 real quick points here. Well, now this, if we think about this way, we think about how we got where we are, and that these things were compromises that served one set. It's not the first time this happened. Where did the Socratic method come from? I got to tell you, there were literally 0 randomized controlled trials in ancient Greece proving the efficacy of the Socratic method. Here's where the Socratic method came from. If I'm Socrates and Plato's sitting back there, and we want to have a conversation, I'm like, yo, Plato. So that tends to be less effective for conversation. So we sit next to each other. There's no evidence that Socratic method is the best way to teach all subjects to all children. It was simply a convenient way to use the available technologies, which was talking to each other. Crazy stuff. Now, one of the reasons that this is actually should be even funnier is when this thing called the printing press was invented 5 centuries ago. Educators who were very attached to the Socratic method were horrified. They were hugely concerned for a half-century about the pernicious effects of the printing press on education, because the huge concern, and those of you who are Lutherans, right, you remember these debates, the huge concern was that if you gave books to students and they went off and read them, they would learn the wrong stuff. Because everybody knows that education requires that the teacher and student interact to get it right. Today, of course, we can't imagine education without books, and people who are deeply concerned about online learning argue about the sanctity of making sure that kids learn by reading. Good. We're deeply concerned right now with trying to figure out, what should the Common Core look like, what should curriculum look like. One of the interesting things is if you look at the American high school curriculum, it was actually mapped off the quadrivium and trivium. Quadrivium and trivium were designed by the cathedral schools in medieval Europe as a way to ensure that folks who were actually going into the priesthood would have minimal literacy so that they could actually read stuff. So we get attached to these things. Why in God's name do we have to actually master the particular science sequence, which we've been doing the way we do it? There's no obvious reason that students ought to go biology, chemistry, physics. In fact, Larry Rosenstock, principal of High Tech High, argues that that when you actually work with people who do secondary science, post-secondary science, a number of them argue that physics ought to come first because it's theoretically cleaner. But you know why we do biology, chemistry, physics? Because it's alphabetical. Literally. All right. So then we got a couple. All right. So what do we do about all this? Well, one solution is, my God, now we've got research, now we've got data sets. I got to tell you, it's not the first time we've had this thought. A century ago, the progressives came up with standardized testing, and were very excited about their abilities to measure efficacy of different learning approaches. They could measure cranial size, all of this. I would suggest that research is enormously useful in some sets of questions. Let's think about, we talk about health model a lot, right? Discrete populations, identifiable interventions, controlled treatments. We're talking about reading programs. We're talking about what's the appropriate way to teach a math curriculum. Hugely confident in the power of RCTs. We're talking about what are smart ways to reconfigure, use talent technology. I am much less confident that we can systematically study our way out of this. Partly what that leads us to is folks like John Engler, former governor of Michigan, who now runs National Association of Manufacturers. John is deeply and absolutely convinced that we've solved all these problems. And all this talk about creative problem solving is just a distraction. He says, damn it, we know it works, let's just do it. We hear this a lot. I would suggest we're not the first people to think that way. Elwood Cubberley, right, who Stanford's Ed School building is named after. Standardized tests, 1919, right, 92 years ago, have meant nothing less than the ultimate changing from guesswork to scientific accuracy. This was a century ago, right? And what I particularly love is the head of the patent office, of course, right, in 1899. Everything that can be invented has been invented. This is the dude who would know. Right. One of the things I worry that we wind up with, because we're unwilling to actually think creatively about why are we doing things the way we're doing, what problem are we trying to solve, is we wind up, good ideas percolate up, But because we're not thinking about what problem are we trying to solve and how do we solve it, what we do is we wind up trying to superimpose the flavor of the month over the rest of the institution. And hence we get the spinning wheels dynamic. So mayoral control. The problem, to my mind, is all of the underlying assumptions of school districts. One of the district pathologies is the incoherence of governance. But if you imagine that simply subsequent mayoral control is going to overcome all the other pathologies, I think you're kidding yourselves. Merit pay. Huge fan of merit pay. The way we pay teachers, I believe, is fundamentally unsound. But it doesn't strike me that a solution is to leave step and lane largely intact and later bonuses based on test score bumps over them. That's taking the best of 19th century teacher pay and the best of 1943 Fuller Brush salesman compensation. This is not, for my mind, a particularly smart or creative way to attract talent in a field where we're trying to do it. Extended learning time. Absolutely. Some kids need a lot more time. Kip uses it magnificently. But we don't need to win these fights for every child across the board. What we need are schools that give kids as much learning time as that kid needs. But instead of talking about how do we make that possible and cost effective, we wind up, say, Chris Gabrielli and Mass 2020 right now are pushing for large-scale, enormously expensive, across-the-board, mandatory extensions of learning time. Fourth, we're going to identify who's good teachers, and then we're going to frog march them to the schools where we think they're needed. We'll talk about the teacher stuff a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time on that. All right. One huge concern with all of this is that, what I'm talking about represents a broad-based and concerted attack on public education. I'll just say, we can talk more about this if you all want. I'll say, real simple response. When we talk about public goods, public services being publicly provided, there's three elements to keep in mind. One is the public pays for it. A second is the public sets some expectations for what it's going to deliver and make sure it delivers them. A third is who actually performs the service. Think about the EPA for a second. We set expectations and we fund it. We make sure that hazardous waste cleanup goes the way it's supposed to. But we don't actually worry about who does it. Most EPA work is done by for-profit companies that bid for these projects. Doesn't mean that they're not cleaning up the environment. In education, we're all in agreement that we want public dollars to pay for education. Except for Andrew Colson. But the rest of us, pretty much, are all cool with public dollars paying for it. We agree. We're going to argue about exactly what the ends should be, but we all agree there should be ends, and we should expect schools to meet those ends. The entire debate, the entire assault on public schooling is really a conversation about who and how is allowed to provide that array of instructional and educational services. And the notion that that somehow represents an assault on anything, rather than an opportunity to think smart about how do you do this well in the 21st century, is, I think, nothing more than a red herring. All right. 5 key challenges. Do you think this way? 1, barriers. There's barriers in statute. There's barriers in regulation. There's barriers in contracts. There's barriers in culture. Second, how do you actually tap and utilize talent a hell of a lot smarter? Third, how do you harness technology, not as something that's gee whiz, but to solve particular problems that you could not solve with what existed a quarter century or a century ago? Fourth, how do you configure dollars so that you can do this stuff smarter and better in a more customized fashion? And fifth, everything I'm talking about now starts to change that coordination game. I said Sears and Roebuck used to be a huge advantage because it made everything a one-shot stop. Nothing wrong with that. If that works, that works. But for way too many kids and way too many families, I think it doesn't work that well. So rather than try to figure out how do you take the old chassis and then put that rocket booster on the back, what I'm suggesting is we need to rethink the entire design process. But let's be honest. What I'm suggesting creates huge new challenges in terms of coordination and in order to ensure that all children are well served. Absolutely. These, to my mind, though, are 21st century challenges and a way for us to stop refighting the same debates and getting excited about the same crappy pilot programs that we've been getting excited about for a half century. I'm not going to run through all these. These are just a couple of the models. One key thing I want you to understand is the last thing I want everybody to walk out of here is that I'm excited about this or that model. I don't care about models. I don't care about programs. What I care about is, can we think differently about tapping talent and tools and technology and resources? And what's cool about these is not that they're models people should do, but that they're examples of people thinking in that way. School of One. You guys, right? Most people in this room are probably familiar with School of One, right? When Joel Rose did this under Joel Klein in New York City, there are now three grade 6 to 8 schools in New York. Joel just broke off from the district and go national. The exciting thing about School of One is not what the achievement results are. They're positive. That's great. The exciting thing about School of One is it's a profoundly different way to think about how do you organize learning. Right? All of our conversations about good curriculum are how do you get the best possible curriculum so that all kids in Arkansas who are learning 6th grade math or social studies will learn the right stuff on day one and will get marched through the right curriculum in terms of scope and sequence through day 180. And what's the optimal pacing? And then how do you give teachers lots of Carol Tomlinson assistance so that they can differentiate effectively within that? Well, as long as you're stuck within that structure, you're pretty damn limited. What School of One says is this is how you used to play albums. You put it in the first song of the first day, first song of the album, and you played it through. Nobody said that was the best way to do it. It was the only way to do it. Well, today you don't have to do it that way. So School of One pre-test kids at the end of, say, 5th grade, going to 6th grade math. Of the 97 learning objectives, or however many it is exactly, they've distilled from the New York curriculum. They then test for each of those components. If a kid knows 23 of those, Jay knows 23 of those, then Jay, first day of school, starts on the 24th. If Pat knows 2 of those, because we know Pat's math skills are suspect, Pat starts with, so one of the things it does is it immediately lets you get out of this habit of kids have to sit there for a day for stuff that they may have already learned along the way. Second thing it does, if it takes Jay twice as long to learn something as Bob, no problem, because we're no longer wedded to having the whole class on a particular set of tasks. Now what we do is we take the 6th grade math teachers in that school and we use other modalities. We use online instruction, computer-assisted instruction. We use tutors. We use whatever it takes to create a set of opportunities for kids to master this stuff. Now, what are the right ways to do it? We have no idea. Are these all equally efficacious? We have no idea. Are there better and worse modalities? There's a million cool questions to ask. But this is a profoundly more interesting way, I think, to think about how you organize this. High-tech, high-ed school. The reason that teacher colleges are at universities is because there weren't that many educated people in the 1840s. So if you wanted to find a couple people who could train teachers, you went to higher ed institutions that were emerging. Today, the trick is not finding people who can do the training. The trick is finding good school placements if you're going to try to do clinical prep. So why build them in higher ed and then look for partners? What high-tech, high-ed school has done is Larry Rosenstock got certified by the State Board of California, and they are now a teacher training program. So every teacher is at high-tech high 45 hours a week, getting tons of hands-on experience, offering a ton of free mentoring to the kids, cutting higher ed out of it, which shaves the cost structure. And then they bring in people, I know this is never my most popular thing in colleges of ed, sorry, but piping in people from higher ed when and if it's useful. Citizen schools. We have this notion today that you're a teacher or you're not a teacher. If you are an astrophysicist or you're an agronomist and you would like to consult in your spare time, that's totally cool. If you want to write freelance articles, that's cool. If you want to try to find a job at the university and let you teach part-time, that's cool. If you want to teach in K-12, we throw up our hands. We don't know what to do with you. What Citizen Schools says is actually, we know from the data, that huge numbers of college-educated adults would like to teach. Woodrow Wilson Institute, 40%. Doesn't mean they want to be teachers. Doesn't mean they want to quit their job and get trained. It means they like to teach. Citizen Schools says we don't just need them as reading buddies for second graders, right? Let's find an astrophysicist and have them read to a second grader twice a month. Right? It's just stupid. Right? Why don't we actually create a mechanism where they come in, we create a mechanism for them going to a school once a week, twice a week. They're actually going to teach a structured course on what they know. Right? We know from the peer modeling research that kids actually benefit from interacting with adults who are not their parents, not their educators. Have these folks in, provide just-in-time support, provide an easy portal, provide the kind of background checks that we need before we're going to let these people work around kids, and they'll do it for free. Right? Citizen Schools is now doing this in 5 states. Tutor.com, 24/7 101 whiteboard tutoring. If you wanted to tutor a kid in math 15 years ago, you needed to have somebody who was a driving distance to the kid's home or school. Today, the kid can get on at 3 a.m., and we can pipe in somebody from Bangalore or Chile. Not an issue. Now, most school districts don't use it, right? Tutor.com's got contracts with 1,800 libraries in the Department of Defense, but only 10 school districts. Because districts say, we don't know where we can possibly find dollars to pay for this. Match School. Mike Gold, you know Mike Goldstein, it's a charter school in Boston. One of the questions is, how do we actually take advantage of Teach for America type talent in a way that actually supports the cost structure of schooling? Well, Mike's got all these AmeriCorps folks who are free to the school, who are actually not teachers. They're tutors. They're living in a dorm he has built next to the school. He's got 80 brand new college grads, half of them going to law school and med school, working for a year, essentially for free. So he's got every child in his school, which is 100% free to reduced lunch, 98% African American Latino. Every single kid in that school is getting 2-in-1, 3-in-1 tutoring several hours a day. Right? And how do you do this with the cost structure? Because he's figured out ways to tap whole new pools of talent. Rocket Ship Academies, San Jose, California. Rocket Ship has a student-teacher ratio. Student-teacher ratio of 32-to-1. But they got a class size of 24-to-1. How do they do this? Alchemy? Right? On the other hand, think about most school districts. Nationally, we've got student-teacher ratio of 15.5-to-1, but class size is 23-to-1. So how does Rocket Ship go the other way? Kids are in school 8 hours a day. A quarter of that time is actually spent with undergraduates who are tutoring them, or with computer-assisted instruction. So when kids are actually in class, it's 24-to-1. But 2 hours a day, they're getting other individual support. 100% free and reduced lunch. It's blowing the numbers off the California API. And it's $500,000 less to run than your typical elementary school, because you can staff it with 5 fewer teachers. All right. Now, again, the one warning I just want to give you, and I'm wrapping, is I'm not talking about innovation. I'm opposed to innovation. Innovation sucks. When you deal with people in other fields, right, they don't go to work and say, this is good, this is innovative. Right? What they usually say is when you're talking about a new application for your iPad, you're talking about a new modification to your cell phone, you're talking about a new feature on a car, you hardly ever see commercials that say, buy our product because it's innovative. What you see is them telling you why this new thing is good, why it's going to help solve a problem that you have. They're not trying to reinvent the iPad, they're trying to make the iPad 1% better. And if you do 1% better and 1% and 1% and 1%, before too long, you're 10% better, then 20% better. And this has been how progress unfolds in most walks of life. In education, we get very excited about innovation. When you innovate something, we say, ooh, go build around it. It's, what we do is, if we were in the health field, if you were in the medical device field, every time somebody came up with a new stent valve, we would say, that's awesome, that's great. Tell you what, why don't you go build a charter hospital where you can use your stent valve? That's not a useful way, right? When somebody figures out how to teach 4th grader ELL kids much more effectively, when somebody figures out how to do 8th grade algebra effectively, there is no reason on earth to think that we want them to go landing a facility, building, recruiting a faculty, writing a 150-page charter application, landing financing, managing the school. All of this takes them out of the one thing they're actually good at doing. So how do we think about creating an educational space where our solution to every problem is not either go consult on this or go open a whole new school, but where we create possibilities for people to come in and solve problems in smart, cost-effective ways. None of that's about innovation. None of it's about innovation. It's about creating opportunities for problem solving. With that, push back. I hardly ever cry, so
Okay, we have time for questions.
Jerry.
I have a comment, or I need some advice. So I found your argument persuasive and your talk engaging. The one problem is I've wasted my time for the past 15 years on everything I've read or written. So help me out. How can we take what we've done and learn how to do, how can we take, we've studied programs, we've studied pilots. We're interested in trying disseminating that. Should we just stop?
No. So you haven't wasted any time at all. So you're good. No, so partly, right? So partly, one thing we get stuck on is we get into this game where we want to do universal fixes, right? The reality is, I think we massively overestimate how good our best schools and our best districts actually are, because I think A, they're piggybacking on what the parents and kids are bringing to school, and B, I think our expectations are insufficiently granular. So we're not very good at asking where are the places we could do better. But, there's lots of places where the political will and political interest is not there for fundamental transformation at this point. And in those contexts, what people want is safe bets, which is not unreasonable, right? We're dealing with our kids, we're dealing with public dollars. So program evaluation, helping people, Pat and I were having this argument an hour ago. We've had, for 20 years, we've had this argument about how do we think about RCTs and what's it mean. Looking at this stuff, convincing people that a voucher program or convincing people that particular new programs are actually at least reasonably effective, that they're not going to be pernicious for kids. This is important because we're not going to go, we throw the doors open and say start figuring stuff out. Well, what's that mean? So there's a huge role for that. But what I worry about, and so really the way to think about, I think, that kind of work, side by side with this, is I believe ideas in and of themselves are consequential. And what I worry about is too often when we talk about programs and talk about program evaluation, the implicit or sometimes the explicit message is this is where we're trying to get to. That this program is the answer. That we need to go from step and lane pay to merit pay based on test scores. And then we will have fixed this problem, we can move on to something else. And the real message here is to think about all these steps as incremental ways to think smarter about the problem we're trying to solve. So, for instance, to think about, say, this in the teacher quality context. I think something like Senate Bill 736 in Florida, which abolishes tenure, more or less, which basically blows up step and lane compensation in Florida, is a good thing. I think part of creating room to solve these problems, to adopt smarter, better programs, is stripping away these barriers. And unlike the private sector, where you get that crop rotation, where the old models just get plowed under and new folks come in, we don't get to do that. If we want to create room, we have to forcefully go in and tear stuff out. The mistake we make is, as we tear that stuff out and start to create room to solve what I call greenfield in my Education Unbound book, we are then impatient for two reasons, I think. One is because we're all in education, make a difference. And by God, we got to make a difference now. And the second thing is that a lot of people in education, I think, don't pay a lot of attention to questions of teaching and schooling. They see schools as black boxes to produce desirable social ends. And so there's a real reluctance to think about how is this stuff actually going to play out organizationally or in terms of the dynamics of the schoolhouse and how can it blow up. So if it looks good on paper, we figure it must play well. So what I'm really making a plea for is that we need to tear room for that. But what happens is in Florida, they then immediately superimpose this ludicrous test-based, half of teacher evaluation and pay is going to be value-added test scores across the board, and half is going to be this massively problematic application of Charlotte Danielson's observational framework. And we're going to do this in 67 counties, everywhere, for everybody. So if somebody had evaluated the Charlotte Danielson program more effectively, I think that's hugely useful. And we can think about how effective is it, how well does it work. But the answer to me is not we do that so that we can then mandate it. We do that so that as we are taking advantage of that greenfield and steering folks to solve problems, that we can draw upon and encourage folks and inform the debate with that kind of research. Heck.
So I'm wondering if our disagreement isn't sort of a glass half full, glass half empty sort of thing. I mean, you look at the institutionalization in education and how it limits, a lot of this exciting stuff. We won't call it entrepreneurial because you don't like that.
Entrepreneurial, of course, just not innovation.
And I look at it and say, it's pretty amazing that a lot of this stuff is happening given the institutional and political constraints. And so the glass maybe is half full. Maybe there's a lot of interesting, diverse, dynamic stuff happening. And secondly, if you remember, in grad school, Ken Schutzler used to always talk about the first rule of wing walking on airplane wings. And that is that you don't let go of something until you have something else to hold on to. And isn't that the role that institutionalization plays, is that it really challenges the new idea to really demonstrate its efficacy before anyone buys into it. Let's take the example of Raj Vinakota, who was out here last week. It was
can't trust anything that guy says, by the way.
If you believe what he says, which Rick says you can't.
No, I'm just
it was just very, very hard for him to launch Seed. It was not easy at all. People didn't make it easy. He had to figure out ways around things. He had to solve a bunch of problems. Well, maybe that's good. Maybe people should face those kinds of challenges and barriers if they're really going to launch something transformational in the area of learning.
No, so there's a couple of terrific points. So 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 on this first point, what was it before Shepsley? What was
It was glass half full, glass half empty. It's amazing how much has happened.
Absolutely, and I think that's fair. And I'm right. I mean, Jay, you introduced me to the Manhattan Institute when I did the comments at school reform, and Jay was like, this is a far more optimistic book than I ever thought Rick would write. And I was like, no. And Jay's like, you really think this will happen? No? And I'm like, no, of course not. Wouldn't it be swell? I'm a notoriously glass half empty guy, and Pat's, a 98% full guy. It's just, boy, But look, so part of it is I'm actually fine with incremental steps. I mean, right? What I'm really talking, a lot of my work is trying to encourage folks to think differently about it. Something's harder to do in a university environment. You're expected to actually generate real knowledge and real research, and certainly not something that gets encouraged very much in education. So one of my roles is just to try to help people kind of stretch our thinking and make sure we're, that we're not satisfied. But that doesn't mean that incremental wins aren't worth winning. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is I think incremental wins have to be won carefully. So for instance, my biggest problem with 736 is not just that I think it's dumb, but that I think it's actually hugely destructive in some ways. For example, my favorite thing about, say, School of One, or Match, or Rocket Ship, is that they get us out of this notion that teachers are teachers. Right? You walk to the best, you go over to the best run district school, best run charter school in almost every case. You're going to visit KIPP, Achievement First, Spire, I don't care. And you say, show me your best fourth grade reading teacher. And you say, show me your worst fourth grade reading teacher. And I'll bet you the dollar donuts are both teaching reading 80 or 90 minutes a day. And they're both doing lunch 40 minutes a day. And they're both doing bus duty. They're both teaching math. Right? It's just like you walk into a hospital. And, your cardiovascular surgeon's about to cut you open. And she looks at her watch. She goes, okay, starts taking off the gloves. You go, what's up, doc? She goes, oh, that was my 80 minutes. But don't worry. The RN is going to cut you. It's really nice. It's a dumb way to use talent. If people are really good at things, you should try to squeeze all the juice out of them. And you should pay them more. We don't pay cardiovascular surgeons more than their anesthesiologist or the RN because they have a different mortality rate. They're on the same team. They have the same mortality rate. But some people's skills are harder to find, are harder to train, and they're more valuable to the team. So in the case of 736, or most of its analogs, the problem is that we are now locking in to the state evaluation and compensation structure an assumption that a teacher's got to own those 24 kids for 180 days. If that teacher doesn't own those kids for those days, you are now inconsistent with the way that the state evaluates and pays people. Now, are there probably going to be workarounds? I sure as hell hope so. But this means that if you are the default superintendent or principal, and you're interested in figuring out ways to squeeze more juice out of your team, if you're interested in going School of One, where no teacher is going to own more than 15% of a kid, if you're interested in typing in online tutoring, which is going to own a piece of a kid, you're screwed. Mike Goldstein's teachers, every one of his teachers qualifies for the teacher bonus in Boston. Mike's proud of this. But he's also an honest guy. He says, look, you know what? A lot of my teachers probably didn't deserve it. But our model makes every teacher look great. When you've got every one of your students has got is being tutored 2 and 3 hours a day, you tend to look really good as a teacher. Now, that's educationally terrific. I mean, we all support this. But right now, we're building into place systems which I worry can foreclose. So now, does that mean we shouldn't do so? No, of course not. But it means that we need to be thoughtful about how do the incremental wins of the moment, how do we design them so that they have appropriate opportunities for people to solve new problems going forward? And part of this is in the wing walker thing. Absolutely, it's appropriate to kind of make sure that we're having this conversation. And there's appropriate, I don't know what the appropriate standards of evidence are, but it's good for us to argue about. And this does belong in the public square. The thing I would just say on Raj, for instance, is I'm totally. It's funny because I did when Raj won the Ash Institute Award at Kennedy School. I was the evaluator on that project. This was when I first met him. I didn't know him then. When you think about Mike Feinberg and Dave Levin in terms of launching KIPP in '94, you think about Raj and Eric Nadler in terms of launching SEED. You think about all of it. Wendy Kopp launching TFA. I'm absolutely fine with the sluice gates being pretty restrictive, in terms of you've got to prove that you're going to spend the money well. But lots of the stuff they go through, I don't think is actually a quality check. I think it's just enormous frustration and bureaucracy.
Maybe let's get some other people in. We get to talk all the time. Let's get other people in. Yeah.
Dennis Beck, Educational Technology. I have an ongoing conversation with a colleague in Canada about online learning, and his side of the conversation is online learning is destroying public schools in America. My side is it is being used to transform public schools in America. What do you see the role of educational technology in helping to break down and transform some of these legacies?
I mean, you think about how technology is used in almost every walk of life, right? I mean, technology, right? I mean, I think your friend's making the same mistake that my friend Diane Ravitch makes. Diane and I we have to debate every couple of months or something or other. She did this book last year that got a lot of attention. One of Diane's things is she says, I don't want kids taught by computers. I'm like, Diane, you were just talking into your cell phone. Were you talking to a cell phone? Right? The cell phone is a mechanism for making it easier for you to connect with a friend. Technology is a tool. Technology is a tool which can allow us to take expertise that once was really hard to attract to rural Arkansas and bring it into that classroom. Technology is a way to bring tutoring that's hard to get otherwise into a child's home or into a child's school. Technology is a way to allow teachers to hand off some of the tedious work, which otherwise they want to actually track. I mean, if you're doing doubles, and the amount of time actually spent just doing the paperwork component, technology can make this easier to assess and easier to utilize the data. Technology, computer-assisted instruction. I mean, nobody's done great, actually, independent evaluations of this, but if you look at the proprietary research from Rosetta Stone and most of its competitors, I have no trouble arguing they're at least as effective as your average middle or high school language teacher. And plus, they can teach you Mandarin or Arabic, which is real hard to find in most school districts. And Vince Bertram in Evansville, Indiana, for instance, has got 17,000 site licenses for something like $42 a kid, whereas his cost per kid, per teacher, per year for foreign language instruction at the secondary level is like $480. So he's saving 90-odd cents on the dollar. Now, are these kids learning from a machine? Well, no. I think they're learning from human expertise that has been filtered down and filed down and poured in the machine, just like when we read a Stephen King book. We're not reading a machine. We're reading Stephen King's words brought to us cheaply and efficiently, courtesy of a machine. So I think we get hugely stuck here. Now, the question, of course, is, look, true that a lot of kids spend 8-10 hours on a weekend really totally immersed in World of Warcraft or whatever.
Which is could be good.
Or bad. Could be good or bad. Exactly. We don't know. And this is true. And it's true that we probably want, for some kids, it probably works just fine. And for other kids, particularly at-risk kids who don't have a strong male role model at home, it's probably hugely crucial that we give them tons of that kind of hands-on attention in a school environment. But now the question is not, is technology good or bad? Technology is a tool. And if what some kids need or a lot of kids need is heavy doses of personal hands-on attention, that's fine. That's great. That's just a design principle. So how do we design schools that use the mix of that and that touch and that attention and that technology in ways that work?
So Caleb, James, and then I'll jump in the queue.
I'm Caleb Rose. I'm a research associate in Ed Reform and a PhD student in public policy. I liked your analogy of Sisyphus and how you tied that into we try these programs out in schools, and then after a couple of years of it not seeming to work as well as we had thought, we just kind of abandoned it. And I think that really ties into some of the other points you were making about we kind of live in this convenience store society where we can get everything instantly and we want results instantly. So most of what you were talking about is how we need to change the way we think about education and delivering it. So how is that any different for us? Why shouldn't we get tired of just thinking about how we're changing things or thinking about how we deliver education? And what's to say that we're not going to get tired of that if we don't see instant results from that?
Oh, we probably will. We probably will. Like I said, I'm a glass half empty kind of guy. But honestly, like I said, I mean, my work is premised. My whole career is within premise on the notion that I think ideas in and of themselves matter, independent of data. Now, not that these other things don't matter too, but independent of emotion, independent of data, independent of research. I think the ideas in and of themselves and how we think about where we're trying to go. And in fact, the last thing I want is a whole bunch of people who have real jobs, either real researchers or real educators, sitting around doing what I do all day, which is just sitting around with my thumb in my ear, thinking interesting thoughts that I don't actually have to do. So I don't think people should sit around and think. What I am trying to do, though, is suggest that, look, people have real problems. There are districts that can't find enough science and math teachers. And our conversation is, how do we recruit more of those teachers? Do we have to pay more? Do we have to train more? I said, wait a minute. Maybe there's lots of other ways to solve this problem. Are we getting full use? Are we squeezing all the juice out of the math and science teachers we already got? Or are we leaving good math and science teacher time currently unutilized? Do we have to get teachers? Are you in a community where there are folks who would want to teach math and science, where we can actually bring them in? So what I want folks to do is not sit around with me and this like have partly because this is what I do, man. I don't want other people to horn in on it. But you know what I want people to do is take what's useful to them, whatever pieces of this speak to them, whatever 5% or 10% or 30% is useful in their work, and then let them use that to give themselves permission to think differently about how you solve these problems. So for instance, I'll just give an example. I'm working with the superintendent in Clark County right now, Vegas. We got to cut $400 million out of their budget, $2.2 billion budget, so we're looking at 19% shortfall. One of the problems is we're looking at taking, elementary class size up to 42, 43, middle school class size up to like 36, high school class, reverse. High school class size up to 42, 43, middle school to like 36, 37, elementary to 33. He doesn't want to do that. It doesn't bother me too much because I'm not really a class size guy, but he doesn't want to do that. So part of the question is we sit down with his budget team and we're trying to tell them, all right, can you generate options for us that are going to generate some of these cost savings, but aren't going to force him to go as high on the class size numbers? They can. They said, well, what else could we do? So we start talking about options. Right? We use things like rocket ship because they're placeholders. But what's really important is the intuition. Well, wait a minute. UNLV is right here. Can we do something where we're bringing in undergrads to provide some of this tutoring so that we're actually structuring the school day in a way that we get the class size down from there? Are there other ways to save on those teachers? So what we're trying to do, what I want people to do is take this kind of thinking and then import it into whatever real challenges they're trying to address and make it work for them.
James?
All right, so you talked a little bit about the common school and the designs of the common school, why it was good at that time, but not so good now, our values have changed. But another good thing is that it provides uniformity. So if you don't want to mandate certain things, you don't think that mandating policies is a great thing. One of the good things about having the common school system is because of the uniformity. And if we're not mandating, there might be a lot of possibilities where we have these disparities. So the school you just talked about, right by UNLV, I mean, that's a great asset to them. A school in Piggott, Arkansas is not buying anything. And so, I mean, if we don't mandate things, if we don't have some sort of box system, then we might be creating more disparity between places. And so, I mean, how do we answer that problem?
It's true. It's true. So, I mean, one, it depends how you design these things. This could be an age-old argument that, back in the early 90s, it was argued that choice plans would inexorably aggravate inequities in urban core. Turns out, one easy response is you say, wait a minute, we're going to offer vouchers to low-income families. Presto, we've taken that problem off the table. So part of it's a question of design, right? A legitimate part of any conversation about this is how do you design policies in ways that address inequities. So that's part of it. And there's no easy answers. And like I said, that's part of that whole coordination stuff. What I argue this moves us into is a conversation where it's about how do we take full advantage of 21st century tools and resources, rather than a conversation about how do we try to retrofit 19th century. But part of that 21st century conversation is we got new problems. That's what. Second is, and this is just me. Well, it's all just me, so who cares? I mean, I think we focus on equity to an extent that's problematic. My friends at Ed Trust disagree. I think, for me, the mission of democratic schooling is not to close achievement gaps. The mission of democratic schooling is to cultivate the gifts and talents of each and every child born in that nation. And I worry that we do a crappy job of that right now, that it's not a priority, that we've got kids who could be mastering Arabic or Mandarin in 9th grade, and we don't make that a priority. We don't worry about how do we create those opportunities, even though maybe it's as easy as saving dollars on foreign language instruction by bringing in new tools. I worry that we don't, that Michael Betts launched a thing, American Youth Music Exchange with the Mind Trust, where he can stand up a fully functioning recording studio in your school for $1,400. we don't pay any attention to these kinds of things. We simply say, well, a music position is going to cost, nationally 72 grand salary plus bennies. Either we have 72 grand or we don't. We're going to have to cut back on music instruction. What we don't do is talk very much about how are we solving all these diverse needs for different kids in different contexts. So for me, and these are arguments we need to have. For me, I am happy to tolerate more disparities in some dimensions if it's going to mean a richer, fuller set of opportunities for kids in general. How much disparity? Well, these are things we need to argue about.
So let me jump in. So I had 3 somewhat connected thoughts. First one was your lecture felt like it was given in passive voice. Who's the actor here that you're talking about? Who's the, that ought to be considered in the design. Who's the designer? And this matters because the designer are a series of political organizations, right? I mean, these are political institutions that are the designers of all this. And your model for how things progress is that people have problems and they solve them. But we have all sorts of problems in our educational system, but these political institutions don't have problems. They're fine, okay? Everything's fine. I mean, money comes in, money goes out, people are employed, people get elected, everything's fine. But, so they don't have a problem to solve. They don't have to solve your problem or anyone else's problem.
Certainly not my problem.
Right. And then the third thought was you convinced me too well that the only way organizations change is by dying. And so I believe you. But what that makes me think is that you give up the game when you say, but we can't do that in schools. But I think we can. And I think it addresses the first 2 things, which is, so how does everything work in all the other examples of progress that you described? Well, there is an actor who's a private actor who has some motivation, problem to solve, and they do it in a market. All markets exist in regulated form, so I mean all markets need rules, whether they're educational or some other. But the way all of these things happen, the way people are motivated to solve problems and figure out how to solve problems is because there's some proper incentive, market incentive out there for them to do it, and that what we have to do is blow up the political control of schools, still have public funding, we can still have public purposes, we still have a regulated market just like we do with every other aspect of our economy, but we turn it over to consumers and we let people figure it out. So are you not going far enough by failing to say that we actually need to blow up schools?
So this is great.
Well, I'll say that louder to the camera. Blow up schools. That's how it came out over the whole system.
Everyone already thought you thought that. Now you said it out loud.
You've hidden it so well for so long. Grad students were here the day you finally.
You're like Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men.
You can't handle it.
So that's interesting, right? So partly, so the passive voice question. I think that's right. I think like I said to Caleb. This kind of stuff on my part is really right. It's a way of thinking differently about these things, and so it's really intended to help folks use it in a way that works for them. So at the district level, we talked about an example of how the idea is to use this to kind of push your thinking of what's possible, partly so that you're thinking about what to ask for. It's a question because you have to change statute, you have to change contracts, but too frequently we don't even know what to ask for when you sit down with students and work on this stuff. At the policy level, we're talking about governors, right? And this gets to the second point, right? It is the case that for whatever reason, sensible or not, there are policymakers who take this on, who decide this is a problem they want to address for whatever reason. And they wind up with agendas that they are going to pursue. They're going to pursue for political gain and out of conviction and whatever else. And partly I think it matters, like this is what we were talking about, how those agendas are shaped. Because I think there is a natural tendency when you're trying to solve these things in the public eye to boil them down to either I'm with the teachers or I am a reformer. And we get in these trenches. And what I'm trying to do here is, at a minimum, suggest that we want to craft these reform policies in a way that creates greenfield and respects opportunities as we win these fights, that creates opportunities for people to not simply embrace robotic new solutions, but to have opportunities to devise and fix stuff. And that gets us to the third piece. And I agree with you, but I think part of the problem is I think we get stuck in this whole school mindset, that when we think about improvement in most walks of life, I don't think the case is that, somebody says, I am going to build a better school. What usually happens is people are good at something, that 1% improvement. We figure out opportunities, right? And I think a great model is kind of, say, the iPhone store, right? Nobody who's going to work in the iPhone store says, I'm going to build a brand new iPhone so that I can write apps for it. Instead, what we try to create, the iPhone becomes a platform on which people can bring their expertise to solve all kinds of small, peculiar problems. That's what I think the schoolhouse needs to be thought of as. The schoolhouse is an entity where we bring together instruction and support and services for kids. The problem is we keep thinking of that school as the unit. And we're going to turn it around, we're going to give people a choice of a better one or what have you. But I think that is profoundly limiting. So I think we actually, and in fact, if you create opportunities for creative destruction when it comes to schools, we know that parents are very attached to schools, right? They're in community institutions, so justifiably you get lots of friction when you try to close them down or take them away. And B, we have lots of reason to think that people who are opening new schools aren't always going to be very good at it. In fact, are pretty damn conventional about how they staff them. But where I think a minimum place where we are exactly on the same page is like Raj's compadres. What Raj is trying to do is start from scratch a particular kind of institution, right? A boarding school. But what are the huge successes, right? The huge successes, to my mind, in the last 15 years of educational entrepreneurship aren't KIPP, which after 17 years serves 27,000 kids. Mike Feinberg, Richard Barth, these are dear friends of mine. I worked with KIPP in Houston. But look, 27,000 kids in 17 years is friggin' slow. After 17 years, Subway had almost 27,000 stores. Okay? So it's really hard to grow these things in whole schools. What are the successful? What are the giant ones? Wireless generation. Wireless generation serves 7 million kids 10 years in. SchoolNet, John Harbor's operation. College Summit. New Teacher Project. Now, the first two have the huge advantage of being for-profit, which I think matters. We're often, even when we talk about for-profit, non-profit, the best case that gets made in education circles is we shouldn't discriminate against for-profits. I think that's mindless. For-profits are unique. They're unique because they are constructed with an eye to generating dividends for shareholders. And what's cool about that is it means they will grow as fast as humanly possible. Now the danger, and that's awesome, that's how you take stuff to scale. The danger of that is that they will, in trying to grow as fast as possible and extract profit, they have every incentive to, on the good side, grow and control costs, but on the bad side, cut corners and deceive potential clients. So let's be honest about this. We need for-profits because that's how you take stuff to scale, but there are these problems that require that we give parents information, that you build sensible regulatory regimes, all of these other things that we take for granted. So what I would just say is I think the place where we get into kind of, because I think that's right, I think that you can't fix all of these systems, but what you can do is you need to create room for people to come in and solve these problems. And I think the easier route is to start thinking about schools and districts, kind of the way Paul Hill talked about his charter districts 10 years ago, is to think about schools and districts as ways to coordinate and deliver varieties of services to kids in effective and manageable ways, but not to think of them as the main providers, but to think of the providers as the people who are figuring out how do you do this stuff that you actually want done.
Well, how about two more? No. I think if people need to leave, this is too great. I want two last questions, and then we're done. I think we have time to get to the airport. So, John, Kim. Yeah.
I was just going to say, so I'm also a person who believes in 1% improvement I'm also a cynic. But what I'm hearing here is you're saying is that what we need to do is recognize that things happen, or not innovation, but change happens in 1% with 1% improvements. But what you're requiring is essentially a complete change in the way that we think about things. So while at the same time you're saying we need to recognize how we need to create a system that allows for us to take advantage of little changes, how realistic is it practically to expect, given how the system has evolved to this point, with its barriers, with its political, what can we do as students, what can we do as people in the future to change this big system in such a way that it allows us to take advantage of what you're talking about?
No, it's a great question. I mean, that's right. I think there's a bunch of different ways, right? I mean, I think that, let's say there's three, that particularly come to mind. One is, this is what Gary and Pat and I were talking about a moment ago, is that the reality is that these are the public's children, these are our kids, these are public dollars. People want some assurance that we're not doing stupid ideas. So the reality is that our thinking is always going to outpace kind of the programs that get designed and what we can evaluate. But you're only going to really kind of, if you think about it as consolidating gains, they're only going to consolidate kind of moving forward when people are comfortable that, yes, we can do this. So when it comes to research, when it comes to evaluation, I tend to think that's not going to make these things possible, but it's going to be important in kind of moving the center of gravity forward as to what we can be comfortable about. I think a second is we often only make these arguments in terms of emoting and in terms of hyperbole. So you're for the kids. We have to do better. We must be competitive. What I think happens too rarely is what I started with, that anecdote about 2001, is I think too rarely people who are really knowledgeable and informed and expert writing in a way that communicates to policymakers and educated listeners, how do we think about these issues differently than we do? And I think that is enormously powerful in terms of opening up opportunities for people to then respond differently. So I think that's a huge opportunity. And then I think a third is to really recognize how it is that transformation usually happens. We were talking last night with some of the grad students. There's really interesting work, say, on the AT&T divestiture. If you remember this, AT&T used to be a phone monopoly. In 1984, the government broke it up. AT&T was a long distance, but there were 7 baby bells, the regional phone companies, right, which were now in a position to compete and do all kinds of stuff. Fascinating work, right? They didn't know what the hell to do. What they mostly do was buy each other up, and so that they could quickly get back to monopoly as fast as possible. Because everybody in those places had spent their entire working careers working for monopoly. You tell them you're free, so they're taking the cage off the canary, it just sits there. Same thing happened in Eastern Europe. Really interesting stuff. Read Eastern Europe about what happened after the Iron Wall came down. Most of the really interesting business development came from Western Europeans, Brits and Germans who came over to Bulgaria and Prague and opened pizza places and stuff because they had an idea of how you do this stuff. So part of what we need to think about if we're going to transform an education space is not just create hypothetical possibilities for people to do different, but understand what does it take to stock that pond with talent. What does it do? What does it take to help people think differently about it? How do we provide the infrastructure and the support? These are kinds of questions that often fall off the table because one side is busy trying to make the argument that it's okay for us to have parental choice, and the other side is busy arguing it's horrific, and very little time is being spent on saying, all right, if you have parental choice, what does it look like to make that serve folks' needs? Same thing with merit pay. If we're going to strip away step-line pay scale, how do you do this in ways that are smart? Huge opportunities for graduate students and researchers to really start offering thoughtful insights on all these counts.
Kim?
My name is Kim Pianowski. I'm a PhD student in curriculum instruction. And first, I just want to say how much I appreciate the conversation are going. I have a hard time finding a home because I don't like big science either. It's refreshing. And it's not really exactly a question, but the whole time you've been talking, I really appreciated your analogy you made with GM, and I was just wondering if you looked at what happened to IBM. Since my brother works for IBM and recently stunned me by telling me that they don't make computers anymore.
It's,
Even if you buy one that says IBM, they didn't make it.
No, I think one of the nice things I think about this conversation and is, one of the fun ways to talk about this, we talk about like GM. We don't spend a lot of time talking about whether GM workers are nice people or not. We say, look, it's an organization which had messed up incentives. The people who were factory workers at GM aren't necessarily heroic. They're not to blame. They're just people who are stuck in. But what's funny for me is when we talk about this in teaching, we get so caught up in the teachers, right? Are you on their side? Are you insulting them? So one opportunity about thinking this way is if we can really focus on what matters and what's interesting and spend less time on this back and forth. So yeah, just the IBM example. It's actually great. In fact, IBM in 1950 was not the dominant, technology company in America. It was Univac. And Univac, we'll just close with this. I think it's great about just the importance of avoiding hubris. Univac got all the smartest people together to figure out whether it should get into the personal computer space. And it brought in dozens of experts from its ranks and around the world, and they calculated how many computers were going to be sold between 1950 and the year 2000 to figure out whether or not Univac ought to invest heavily in the space. And they figured out worldwide by the year 2000 that there would probably be about 200 computers sold. And what they meant, of course, is that this was when computers were the size of this room. And they couldn't project what technological evolutions might evolve, so they were trying to make best case assessments based on what they knew then and there. Now what happened, of course, is Univac gave away to IBM. IBM was offered the Microsoft software by Bill Gates and Paul Allen in 1979. IBM said, we don't want to buy it. We don't know what to do with it. Tell you what, we'll lease it. So in order to be able to lease it off, Paul Allen and Bill Gates had to form a little company that would lease it out. It was called Microsoft. And so what happens is it's not that IBM didn't have people who were really smart and analyzed the market, but they saw the world in a certain way. So really what we're talking about here is how do we get into a habit of thinking about the world, not just extrapolating from what we know and already think, but how do we kind of open ourselves to the possibility that we can think smarter and differently about how do we use tools, talent, resources, technology going forward. Thanks so much, guys.